So we figured out the strategies that microorganisms employ to evade host immunity. Now, of course, in terms of the infection, we are mostly interested in actual disease, right? So the infectious disease is, goes through several pretty typical stages. The first stage, or the first period, is the incubation period. That's the time when you have no observable signs or symptoms. Incubation period may be very short. It may be very long. Basically, the longest incubation periods that we know of are for prion diseases, such as, we mentioned Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, the mad cow kind of thing. For those where incubation periods were registered as long as 5 years. Okay, so from the moment of infection to the onset of an actual disease. But that's pretty rare. Generally speaking, incubation periods all lie within 1-2 weeks. And after incubation period, when pathogen kind of starts to multiply, the prodromal period follows up. So prodromal period is the period of sort of mild symptoms. You know what I'm talking about? Like when you go home and you think you kind of sick-ish. So maybe you have a little bit of a headache, a little bit of a throat scratch, but it's not too bad yet. Obviously, there is no real defined boundary, between the prodromal period and the actual illness. You can say, okay, at 9:17 p.m., my prodromal period ended and my actual disease started. One goes into another quite smoothly. When I say actual disease, I mean, okay, let's take something more terrible than influenza virus, say rabies, okay? During the prodromal period for rabies, there's an incubation period, no symptoms, no signs. Then there is a prodromal period when a person experiences anxiety, fear, depression, stuff like that, mainly psychological issues. And then there goes an actual disease with photophobia, phonophobia, hydrophobia, paralysis, and stuff like that. That's actual disease. Does that make sense? Now, eventually, as you can imagine, disease culminates either in the death, happens, or it can start to decline. The period of decline, pathogen is either gone or not really in huge amounts. And if everything goes well, the patient recovers, and that recovery period is called period of convalescence, or convalescent period. Now, why we actually are focusing on the stages of the disease, more of a clinical aspect, if we try to study the pathogen? Well, because during each stage, pathogen replicates to different extent. Now, this graph that you see here shows somewhat of a generic example of pathogen dynamic during disease. You see that in this example, pathogen starts to replicate during incubation period. Replication increases during prodromal period and period of illness, and then declines as the patient approaches the recovery. Now, a couple of things. First of all, for some pathogens, the main replication may happen way into incubation period. For instance, it is known that patients with influenza virus, most of the viral replication happens during incubation period. So people shed influenza, start shedding influenza, way before they start to show any symptoms. Does that make sense? So every time we look at multiplying or not multiplying of a pathogen, we should say in most cases. So in most cases, the peak multiplication happens during the actual disease. Makes sense, right? You understand what I'm trying to say? Or you can say, okay, the person has completely recovered. Does that mean that the pathogen is gone? Not necessarily. Okay, it still can be replicating, just the immune system just crushes it. Now, in addition to, so you have to know the stages of the disease, and you have to be able to recognize the stage based on the description. You also should be able to tell the sign from the symptom. Now, sign is objective. Symptoms are subjective. So basically, if you come to the doctor and you tell that you have a headache, is that a sign or a symptom? It's a symptom. Now, if you come to the doctor and tell doctor that you have nausea, is that a sign or a symptom? It's still a symptom. But if you vomit in front of the doctor, that's a sign. Because it's objective. It's not you're saying, okay? The doctor observes what happens to you as the result of this infection. Got it? Signs can be measurable or not. Say if the doctor sees any kind of rash, that's not measurable, just they're not. But you can measure things like white blood cell counts or fever, temperature basically. Fever is the sign. Blood temperature, body temperature can be measured, blood pressure can be measured, things like that. We're clear? So basically anything that is absolutely self-reporting is a symptom. Again, I give you a list asking which of the following is a sign or which of the following is a symptom. We got it? Which brings us to the localization of infection. So infection can be localized. Frontal, boil. Infection is restricted to the portal of entry. Same story, for instance, pharyngitis, bacterial pharyngitis. Does that make sense? So you have an infection at the portal of entry. You inhaled Streptococcus pyogenes. It caused bacterial pharyngitis. Now, focal infection spread from the original site of infection to another. So that's continuing that example with Streptococcus. Untreated pharyngitis leads to endocarditis. You have now second focus of infection. So focal infection is still fairly limited. Or let's say you had streptococcal pneumonia, which led to streptococcal meningitis. Original localization was lungs. Second focus was brain. Does that make sense? And finally, systemic infection, when microorganism is disseminated. That requires the presence of microorganism in the blood. And the presence of microorganism in the blood, we call it emia, microbemia. Okay, bacteremia, bacteria in the blood. Viremia, virus in the blood. Fungemia, fungus in the blood. We clear? Now, we do experience viremias and bacteremias on a regular basis. You may have viremia, presence of virus in the blood, without any disease following it. You get exposed to it. Make sense? Every time, I told you, every time you brush your teeth, you have bacteremia. When microorganism starts to replicate in the blood, we specifically call it septicemia. Okay? And usually microbial replication in the blood leads to sepsis. The overwhelming, overactive, abnormal immune response that causes, vasodilation, vascular shock, hypovolemic shock, stuff like that. Does that make sense? So if bacteria is in the blood, that's just bacteriemia. If it replicates there, that's septicemia. We're good? Now, time-wise, infection can be primary and secondary. I'm sorry. So can be primary infection can be, say, urinary tract, UTI, and the microorganisms from UTI can be transferred to, say, vaginal mucosa and cause vaginal infection. But the key word here is then. So primary infection occurs first, secondary infection occurs after. For instance, you can have influenza, and then after influenza, you have streptococcal pneumonia. It's actually shown that during the pandemic of Spanish flu in 1918, okay, the good chunk of people who died actually died of the streptococcal pneumonia that started because of influenza virus infection. That make sense? Now, the next three terms often cause a lot of kind of questions. So first term is, first of all, there's one term that we commonly use, it's not even on the slide, it's term acute. Do you understand what acute infection means? Like, it's really rapid and it's short term. So say when you have common cold, that's acute infection. When you have influenza, it's acute infection. When you have strep throat, that's acute infection. Makes sense? Now, acute infections can become latent infections. Say, when you have mononucleosis, infectious mononucleosis, that's acute infection with Epstein-Barr virus. Eventually, Epstein-Barr virus, as any other herpes virus, becomes latent. And latency means that there are no signs, no symptoms, no clinical syndrome. The microorganism does not replicate, it's in a dormant state. However, it can reactivate from time to time. So one of the classic, probably the best example of latency is herpes virus, HSV type 1. The cold sore. If you are HSV1 positive, normally you don't have a cold sore, right? So virus does not replicate, it just sits quietly, dormantly in the neurons. When you get immunosuppressed, virus replicates, spreads to the epithelium on the lips, and you develop cold sore. Does that make sense? Then immune system waxed it, and the virus is gone. It's basically kind of a game of whack-a-mole. Virus raises its head, immune system, and it can raise its head because immune system is not fully functional. So when it becomes fully functional again, when you're good, immune system knocks the virus out, no replication, no symptoms again. That makes sense. So latency, no signs, no symptoms, and no virus replication. Chronic infection. Long-term with clinical syndrome and microorganism replicating. Example. Well, tuberculosis can be a good example. Okay. Chronic tuberculosis. Microorganism replicates. You do have symptoms. They are not, lethal, not extremely severe, but, that's a disease. Hepatitis B and hepatitis C cause chronic liver infections. They replicate at a fairly low grade, They cause moderate clinical syndrome. Does that make sense? So both, there is a clinical syndrome and microorganism replicates. And then finally, persistent infection. It's kind of an interesting thing. There are some pathogens that can replicate without causing any clinical syndrome. You've all heard the story of Typhoid Mary, I suppose. A woman that lived in New York in the early 20th century. She had a persistent salmonella infection in her gut. So salmonella enterica was replicating. She was shedding it, but she never had any signs or symptoms of salmonellosis. A pretty common example of persistent infection, cytomegalovirus. Usually it is acquired by children in the daycare during that time. And you can see, and the symptoms of cytomegalovirus, I mentioned it, it's either asymptomatic or very, very mild disease. Does that make sense? Well, it turns out that even if the kid shows the signs or symptoms for that mild CMV infection, usually like something like a common cold, eventually the disease is gone. But you can detect cytomegalovirus in a pretty large loads in the urine for a couple of months afterwards, meaning that there's still replication going on. No clinical signs, no clinical symptoms, just persistent infection. You see the difference between these three? Latent, chronic, persistent. Again, definition, term, matching, yes.
What about like mono? Because like I had it when I was younger, and then they said I had a blood test recently, and they told me that they could tell I had it in the past.
Yeah.
So what would that be filed under?
You have latent infection with Epstein-Barr virus. And at the moment when you have mononucleosis, you had an acute infection with Epstein-Barr virus. Does that make sense? So acute latent infection is preceded by some kind of an acute infection. That makes sense. Sequelae, the term sequelae, just consequence. When we say neurological sequelae, say polio infection leads to development of neurological sequelae. We're good so far? Okay. So, well, portals of exit, we talked about them. Respiratory, skin, bodily fluids, blood. Now, I really want to focus on two terms, really important terms. The reservoir and the host. So we're going to play with some real-life examples of reservoir and host. Reservoir is something, living, non-living, doesn't matter, that is absolutely essential for the life cycle of the microorganism. Examples of non-living reservoirs, soil or water. Does that make sense? Say, we talked about Naegleria fowleri, the amoeba that can cause meningoencephalitis. Remember? The brain-eating amoeba. It normally can be found. It can be found in the soil or in the water. And soil and water are essential. You remove soil or water, amoeba dies. Does that make sense? So that's going to be the reservoir for this microorganism. Got it? Now, living reservoir. Well, let's say bats for Ebola virus are the reservoir. Basically, the rule of thumb is you remove the reservoir. Like you say, okay, what if the reservoir is gone? What if this animal is gone? Will it lead to complete elimination of the microorganism? In Ebola case, first of all, it's really hard to establish what is reservoir. Yes, you have a question. Getting there. Getting there. Not really. We'll get, so example, dengue virus. The reservoir is the human. It turns out not only humans, also monkeys. So if you would remove all monkeys, we'll get to mosquitoes. And yeah, they do participate in the transmission, but if you get rid of all monkeys and all humans, hypothetically, dengue virus is gone. You get rid of only one, like you get rid of all the humans, it can still circulate through monkeys. Does that make sense? You get rid of monkeys, it can circulate through humans. West Nile virus, a great example, West Nile virus. It's a reservoir of birds. And we'll get to the idea of host as well, but birds die from it. But it exists in birds. It's transmitted to humans from birds. Does that make sense? That makes birds a reservoir. Now, host is an animal, strictly animal, and presuming that humans are animals as well. Okay. Host is, getting sick. So in case of West Nile virus, birds are both reservoir and the host. You see what I'm trying to say? So birds are reservoir, but they also are considered hosts of West Nile virus infection. Humans for West Nile, we are hosts of the infection. We can be infected, does that make sense? But there is no transmission of West Nile virus from person to person. Same goes for rabies. The reservoir for rabies are wild animals, like coyotes or foxes or skunks, okay, raccoons. Does that make sense? You get rid of all those wild animals, rabies is gone. Actually, in Britain, they managed to completely eliminate rabies on the island by literally vaccinating every wild animal. It was super elegant program. They managed to prepare an oral vaccine, and they put it in a kind of bait, okay, that animals ate actually, and they had helicopters dropping the baits all over the forests, and they eventually completely eliminated rabies from Great Britain. The downside is that animal quarantine. If you want to bring your animal to Great Britain, the quarantine time is like 6 months. So if you want to bring your dog, you have to keep the dog in the quarantine for like 6 months, because they want to make sure that there are no diseases. They can actually, since it's silent, it's quite convenient to eliminate the disease. Does that make sense? So wild animals, in case of rabies, are the reservoir. Humans are the hosts, and largely accidental hosts. Okay. Now, getting back to Jacob's question, what about the mosquito in case of dengue? Mosquito is considered to be a vector. Vector is the animal in, like, honestly, usually arthropod. I'm not aware of any other type of vectors. Mosquito is the vector that transmits the infection from person to person, monkey to person, monkey to monkey. Does that make sense? So there are a bunch of vectors. I used to have a 2-page table of various vector-borne diseases. Now that's the term that I just want you to counter. Vector-borne. So borne part, like airborne disease, transmitted through the air, okay? Blood-borne pathogen, transmitted via blood. Vector-borne pathogens, transmitted by vectors. You with me? Vectors can be mechanical, like this unlucky gentleman here. The fly landed on the pile of feces first, and then on his sandwich. Okay, so it mechanically transmitted whatever was on that pile of feces on the sandwich. Right? There's no replication involved, just an accidental mechanical transmission. We're clear? Now, biological vectors, of course, are of much bigger importance. So in case of biological vector, you have say a mosquito that bites an infected person, okay, and then the pathogen replicates inside of the mosquito. Say in case of malaria, mosquito bites a person with malaria. Malarial parasite actually goes through the sexual stage in that infected person, in that mosquito. Does that make sense? So it goes through the sexual stage of reproduction in the mosquito, and then mosquito bites somebody else who's not infected and transmits the disease to them. Absolutely. Humans are reservoir for malaria, for human malaria. That's important because there is a bird malaria, and birds are pretty okay with that. Practically every bird in the United States has malaria, but it's kind of mildish. They don't die from it pretty often. Make sense? And what's good about this, as far as we know, there's no cross-infection, cross-species infection. So bird malaria doesn't infect humans, and vice versa. So if you get rid of humans, you get rid of malaria. Okay? Now, transmission routes. So I wanted to talk about some terms in regards to transmission. So we'll get to the routes first. The term carrier. The term carrier is usually applied to a human that can transmit infection. So those are 5 carrier types that you have to know. And they're all fairly intuitive, right? So asymptomatic, for instance, asymptomatic carrier. I gave you this example before. Your entire family is down with flu, except you. Okay, does that mean that you don't have an infection? Not necessarily. You may have an infection. It may be asymptomatic due to your, superior immune system. But that means that you probably can shed this virus. You go to work. You think you're fine, and you are, but you still shed the microorganism. Does that make sense? You have asymptomatic infection, and you shed microorganism, although you have no symptoms. Okay? Incubation carrier. You are about to get down, but you're still okay. You are in your incubation period, so you can carry this disease over, and pass it on. Does that make sense? So eventually you're going to come down. Convalescent carriers. A really big concern for gastrointestinal infections. I mentioned norovirus before. The causative agent of viral gastroenteritis, two-bucket disease, winter vomiting disease, all those wonderful names. So it turns out when a person recovers, and the disease lasts for like 2 days. When the person recovers, the person will shed the virus for 2 to 3 weeks. Does that make sense? So that's convalescent carrier. Chronic carrier is kind of self-explanatory, really. Chronic infection. And passive carrier, the person that doesn't really have an infection, that's hospital-acquired diseases, when somebody who's involved in patient care accidentally transfers microorganism from infected to uninfected person. Does that make sense? So I give you an example. You tell me what type of carrier it is. Good? Vehicles versus fomites. Vehicles matter. Okay? Things like food, water, air, all of it is vehicle. Okay? Say, vehicle for measles transmission is air, because it's respiratory transmitted. Does that make sense? Salmonellosis can be transmitted with food, with eggs, so eggs are going to be vehicle for transmission. Fomite, the object. Doorknobs, the fomite. Dirty dishes is a fomite. Okay. Keyboard is the fomite. Coffee mug is a fomite. Now, transmission routes. On the left, you see the direct routes. I want to make a very clear distinction between the contact and the respiratory route. So what is respiratory? Respiratory route is the one that involves aerosols of a very particular size. When I speak now, do I form aerosol? Yeah, absolutely. When I breathe, do I form aerosol? Yeah, because, water that comes out of the lungs, the water vapors, they condensate and they form very, very, very fine aerosol. So there is an actual quantitative limit. I don't remember the number, neither should you. There is a quantitative limit on the size of the aerosol for the infection to be considered respiratory transmitted. Measles, influenza, rubella, mumps, Streptococcus pyogenes, respiratory transmitted. And that's really important because, for instance, why influenza is more common during the cold than during the heat. One of the hypotheses, we still don't know the answer, by the way, but one of the hypotheses, and it's a model that works pretty fine, that in the cold environment, in the cold air, respiratory aerosol of that particular size travels farther, enabling better transmission. Does that make sense? So again, if I cough or sneeze on someone, it doesn't matter whether it's January or July, because in this case, I encourage the contact transmission of the infection, such as an Ebola virus. There were claims, Ebola is respiratory transmitted because people were like violently coughing, and that, yeah, if you violently cough and spitting mucus all over the place, that's not respiratory transmission anymore. That's bodily fluids contact. Does that make sense? So you see the difference between respiratory and contact. Vertical, from mother to child, can be transplacental or congenital. You understand the difference, right? So transplacental is like HIV, transmitted directly through placenta, crosses the placental barrier. Congenital is infections like herpes. It kind of more broad. You can technically consider transplacental transmission congenital as well, but when a child acquires a bacterial infection, Streptococcus agalactiae, while passing through the birth canal, that's the typical congenital infection, but it has nothing to do with placenta. Does that make sense? And the third is vector. Now, vector-borne diseases are directly transmitted. That is considered a direct route. Now, what does that mean? Back to dengue question. So, vector, mosquito, bites an infected person, flies to uninfected person and bites uninfected. Direct, right? Now, in some textbooks, example of direct vector transmission is West Nile. It's not true. West Nile virus cannot be transmitted from person to person. There is no direct transmission of West Nile virus from person to person. Does that make sense? Indirect transmission. Fomites, considered to be indirect, meaning I sneeze in my palm, touch an object, somebody else touches an object, acquires the infection. So object is involved.
So I had a teacher who passed out vertebra when we were going over the spine for AP.
Yeah, it was me.
No,
No? Okay.
a long time ago.
I passed out some...
They had strep.
Who? Teacher?
Yeah. The teacher had strep throat, coughed in the hand, touched the vertebrae with that hand.
Yeah. Classic. Yeah.
The whole class got strep.
Really?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. The great example. Thank you. The great example. Okay. This is why we do this.
Yes.
Or, yeah. Now, that's one. Vehicle transmission is considered to be indirect. Now, there are tons of examples. One of my favorite examples of vehicle transmission, there is a wonderful disease called tick-borne encephalitis. It's not present in the United States at all. It's just European. Okay. So, usually it is transmitted by the tick bite. But there are reports of the transmission of tick-borne encephalitis from an infected cow through milk, which is very unusual. But in this case, when it's transmitted from infected cow to a human via milk, it's vehicle transmission. Does that make sense? So there is sort of a separate, it's still vehicle transmission, but I want to aerosol transmission or air transmission. I mentioned, I believe I did. If I didn't, it's fine. So there is a virus called hantavirus. And if you search on Google hantavirus, you will find out that there were outbreaks in Four Corners region, the United States. There were outbreaks in Yosemite National Park. This is the virus, which reservoir are deer mice. But deer mice, during the time, if I remember that ecology right, I think it was this way. So there was a really hot summer, which killed a lot of crops, which mice usually ate. So they started to move to the human dwellings. Does that make sense? And kind of getting into the human houses, and they were pooping and peeing on the floor, mice, I mean, and people just, were sweeping the floors, and they aerosolized the virus that was on the floor, put it in the air, inhaled it, got the infection. Okay, so if they would just basically handle a mouse, there would be no transmission. For that particular hantavirus, the sin nombre virus, there is no person-to-person transmission. You can have hantavirus and you cannot transmit it to another person. Does that make sense? So that's air transmission. We're going to wrap it up now, and I will see you on